The first documented encounter with humans is still classified in many sectors, not because of strategic importance, but because of the embarrassment it caused to the Galactic Observation Corps. At the time, humanity was believed to be an unremarkable species, emerging from a small Class 4 biosphere in the spiral arms of a nondescript galaxy. Their electromagnetic leakage had finally reached detectable thresholds, full of erratic patterns, unstructured noise, and something the researchers termed music, though it bore no discernible data logic. When the Council dispatched its standard first contact unit to observe and, if suitable, integrate the species, the mission was considered low priority. The initial scout drone entered Earth's orbit unnoticed and began streaming data. Pollution levels, atmospheric instability, countless regional conflicts, short biological lifespans, and highly inefficient governments. In summary, they were chaotic, tribal, and technologically unstable, a world on the verge of self-destruction, perfect candidates for quiet observation, perhaps cultural upliftment later. But when the scout attempted passive tagging of a communications satellite, it was shot down. Not hacked, not jammed, shot by a ballistic missile launched from Earth's surface with brute force. The humans had apparently tracked it with radar and acted without negotiation. No other species had ever reacted so aggressively to an unknown object in orbit. The incident was deemed an outlier until the second drone, cloaked and silent, was disabled by a laser weapon from a high-altitude jet prototype. This time, Earth's militaries had coordinated globally to respond. Not only had they noticed the intrusion, they had adapted reverse, engineered the signal, and begun broadcasting encrypted taunts back into deep space. The humans were not fearful. They were curious, angry, and above all, ready. It became evident that humans did not possess interstellar travel, yet their capacity for swift innovation and reactive violence surpassed anything previously documented in a pre-FDL civilization. When a diplomatic vessel finally landed under truce protocols in what humans call the Mojave Desert, the crew expected a quiet audience with primitive scientists. Instead, they were greeted by 8 military units, 2 covert intelligence agencies, and a scientist who politely informed them they were violating airspace. A trade proposal was given. The humans offered nuclear warheads for shield technology. It was not fear that motivated them. It was interest, ambition, and an almost disturbing lack of reverence for their visitors. They treated the envoys like diplomats from rival nations rather than beings from another world. The Galactic Council, shaken but intrigued, sent cultural liaisons to study human society up close. The resulting logs were confusing. This species consumed art that glorified rebellion, worshipped flawed heroes, celebrated their own failures through comedy, and taught their young with imaginary stories involving space wars, alien invasions, and dystopian futures. One analyst wrote, "It is as though they were preparing for us before we even arrived. The humans had no central planetary authority, no single religion or cultural paradigm. Their species operated under ideological friction, and yet they had landed machines on other moons, pierced their atmosphere with reusable ships, and split the atom long before unification." In the words of Ambassador Trilkin of the 7th Archive Fleet, "We did not find a species waiting for peace. We found a species training for war, singing about it, writing poems about it, dreaming of it. Humanity was not what the galaxy had expected. They were not the meek children of a lonely world. They were wolves in tattered flags, with minds full of mythology and hands already bloodied by their own history. The first contact logs were updated not with the usual recommendations for upliftment, but a warning: approach with respect, observe with caution, engage at your own risk. It was the Zarth, I Dominion, that first attempted to eliminate humanity in what would later be known as the Ember Skirmish. Their armada was vast, disciplined, and armed with generations of perfect war logic. Humanity, by contrast, was still adjusting to FDL travel, just decades into space colonization, with scattered outposts and no centralized galactic military. The Dominion expected an easy purge, quick surgical strikes, psychological suppression, and complete compliance. Instead, they found something that baffled their war algorithms: humans who refused to die, entire colonies on the edge of destruction, rerouted life support to power weapons, civilian engineers' jury rigged atmospheric processors into pulse cannons. Medical personnel operated while under orbital bombardment. There were no retreats, only delays. When cornered, humans didn't surrender. They detonated their own bunkers, taking Dominion troops with them. Dominion reports speak of losing control, not because of technological inferiority, but because of the psychological shock of watching a species choose extinction over submission. One general noted, "They fight as if death is a footnote, not a conclusion." After action, scans showed humans surviving in irradiated bunkers with improvised filtration systems. In one now legendary case, a group of miners trapped beneath a collapsed moon outpost remained alive for 43 standard days by cannibalizing their dead and repurposing mining drones to dig toward the surface, only to rejoin the resistance after rescue. The Dominion, increasingly alarmed, launched morale disruption campaigns using chemical agents, psychological broadcasts, and memory scramble pulses. The humans responded by adapting to the toxins, hacking the Dominion signal, and broadcasting their own messages, music filled with screaming guitars and lyrics about burning empires. What no Dominion strategist understood was that humans evolved on a planet defined by chaos, natural disasters, predators, famine, war, plagues, and had grown not in spite of it, but because of it. They normalized hardship, celebrated survival. The greater the pressure, the more feral and innovative they became. Even when ships were lost, settlements destroyed, and communication cut off, they simply did not break. A defeated human was not demoralized, they were motivated. When the Galactic Peace Accord intervened to end the Ember Skirmish, the Dominion had lost over a third of its incursion force. Humans, statistically, had suffered greater losses, but the final casualty reports showed something chilling. For every Dominion soldier killed, 5 more humans signed up to fight. No surrender, no retreat, just endless resistance. One captured human soldier, when interrogated on why they resisted annihilation so fanatically, answered with a smirk, "You can kill us, but you'll never outlive us." The phrase later became a slogan etched into hulls of human warships and whispered in Dominion command chambers with dread. Other species began to take notice. Inhuman, yes, but unbreakable. What was once considered irrational was now seen as uniquely effective. The viral nature of human tenacity spread across sectors. Resistance movements on other worlds began studying human tactics. Songs in human languages were adopted by alien dissidents. The legend of the species that refused to die had taken root, not just in fear, but in admiration. Humanity, to the shock of the galaxy, had weaponized survival itself. The first signs of emotional contagion were subtle, almost imperceptible, logged in clinical xenopsychology, reports from observation teams stationed near the outer colonies of humanity. An Ulnari diplomat described their first treaty discussion with a human envoy as disorienting, noting that the human alternated between passionate appeals, self-deprecating humor, tears of sincerity, and unexpected storytelling, all within a single negotiation. What should have been a cold exchange of trade rights turned into a dinner of shared memories, laughter, and solemn silence as the human recalled Earth's extinct species and lost languages. The Ulnari, a species that communicated largely through color shifts and pheromonal emissions, left the meeting strangely subdued. For days, their own diplomats displayed signs of confusion, colors indicating grief and inspiration at once. It became a trend. Wherever humans went, they left behind not just contracts or technology, but feelings, deep, resonant emotions that somehow lingered. Emotional contagion was initially treated as a social anomaly, a quirk of an overexpressive species whose neurological wiring was simply too raw. But the pattern spread. An entire Plerethian outpost known for strict data protocol suddenly began composing songs in binary after a human engineer introduced them to blues music. A K'tal military unit that had historically avoided civilian populations began defending a human colony against pirate raids, citing emotional reasons. In their log, a phrase never before recorded in their history. Researchers attempted to quantify the phenomenon. It defied metrics. Human emotions were not just expressed, they were transmitted. Their stories, whether spoken, sung, or written, carried cultural payloads that embedded themselves in alien minds. Even species with no eyes or ears found themselves dreaming in metaphor after human contact. The Arakan Council declared this a cultural security risk, fearing that exposure to human art and narrative might destabilize galactic equilibrium. They banned direct transmission of human media in 2 sectors. The result, an explosion of underground human content. Bootleg copies of human films, speeches, and novels flooded alien networks. One viral video showed a Martian child reading a poem about Earth's final sunset. The clip was downloaded 50 million times on Calgaris Prime, a planet where sunsets had no cultural meaning. Until then, alien societies began mimicking human behaviors, feasting rituals, funerals, even romantic courting. Alien youth shaved their crests or adjusted bioluminescence patterns to resemble famous human celebrities. Galactic corporations began marketing humans. Style emotional experiences simulated heartbreak, laughter, nostalgia, for species who had never naturally experienced them. The more the galaxy tried to isolate humanity, the more it absorbed their essence. It wasn't just art. Human emotional logic began bleeding into diplomacy and warfare. Species once bound by rigid logic began questioning their leadership, citing human quotes like "the heart knows what the mind fears." Political revolts were triggered by translated human speeches, once thought too sentimental to be strategic. And within militaries, some officers refused to carry out extermination orders after exposure to human memoirs or battlefield transmissions laced with lullabies and family recordings. Humanity had discovered, perhaps without trying, its most dangerous weapon, empathy, not as a weakness, but as an invasive force that infected other species with longing, conscience, and memory. Galactic minds accustomed to precision and clarity now wept, dreamed, and hesitated. And in the war councils of the most calculating empires, a terrifying realization began to form. Humanity didn't need to conquer planets. They simply haunted them. Diplomatic encounters with humans were initially considered a secondary concern by most galactic species. Humans, after all, were young, fragmented, and prone to emotional outburst, attributes typically associated with weak negotiation skills. But those assumptions were obliterated after only a handful of treaty sessions. Humans, it turned out, were terrifying diplomats, not because of traditional strategy or structured logic, but because of their unpredictability, emotional depth, and psychological manipulation. A single human negotiator could walk into a room of 10 alien ambassadors and destabilize centuries of established protocol within an hour. They didn't debate, they connected. They spoke in metaphors, weaved personal anecdotes into trade arguments, and used silence with the precision of a weapon. Where other species relied on law, precedent, or shared genetic memory, humans used storytelling, passion, and something entirely alien to the galaxy: humor. In one recorded incident, a human ambassador negotiating with the rigid legalists of the Welsh collective derailed 2 months of deadlocked conversation by faking a coughing fit, cracking a joke about his species being allergic to bureaucracy, and casually referencing a childhood memory of his mother bartering for shoes in a dust storm. The Welsh stunned into laughter, a reaction never before documented in their species, granted him 3 concessions by the end of the session. Galactic diplomats quickly realized that humans didn't see negotiations as zero-sum games. They turned them into performances complete with pathos, misdirection, and improvisation. They could cry on cue, confess failure with sincerity, or feign indifference while probing for weakness. They told stories that had no relevance to the deal, only to reveal hours later that the tale had hidden analogies and moral leverage. They negotiated like they were building friendships or declaring war, often both at once. More alarmingly, humans could empathize with opponents to the point of mimicry, reflecting back their counterparts' values and fears until the opposing negotiator wasn't sure if they were being understood or manipulated. Many alien leaders described the experience as emotionally hijacking, a term that spread across diplomatic logs with concern. Human diplomats weren't trained in a singular method. They drew from chaos, instinct, history, and even pain. Some had survived war zones, others were poets, others still were former convicts turned statesmen. Their backgrounds made them impossible to predict. This diversity, combined with their cultural willingness to challenge norms, created an entirely new type of galactic presence, the nightmare diplomat. The Telari Consortium, known for their emotionless logic and superiority complex, once sent a renowned diplomat to dominate a trade agreement. The human representative greeted her with a poem about extinction, shared tea from a plant grown in the soil of a battlefield, and ended the negotiation with a request to visit the Telari diplomat's homeworld to understand you better, not for advantage but for kinship. The Telari conceded more than they intended, then later admitted they felt emotionally compromised, but weirdly proud. Human negotiation was not about control. It was about shaping the experience, and in doing so, they left their mark not in treaties, but in the minds of their rivals. They negotiated with ghosts at their back and dreams in their hands. They threatened, pleaded, joked, and inspired, sometimes in the same sentence, and when it was all over, their counterparts left not just with new agreements, but with altered perspectives. In the Galactic Archives, there is a note appended to all human diplomatic briefings: engage with caution. They may lose the deal, but they will win your heart, your doubts, or your future. Humanity's relationship with other species never followed expected patterns of domination, subservience, or neutrality. Instead, it followed a trajectory so erratic, so intensely personal, that xenobiologists and sociologists alike found themselves at a loss to categorize it. For humans, interaction was never just interaction. It was potential symbiosis. Whether it was a battlefield, a laboratory, or a prison cell, they formed bonds, created emotional attachments, and forged alliances where none should logically exist. The Grontal, a species of 12-limbed carnivorous war, beasts bred solely for combat, were unleashed by their creators to wipe out a rogue human colony. Within 6 weeks, several Grontal were discovered fighting alongside the humans. One had even tattooed a human war poem into its own skin using acidic claws. When interrogated by its handlers, it reportedly stated, "They sing when they bury their dead. We do not sing. I want to learn." The handlers decommissioned the creature. It died humming. On another frontier world, a rogue AI originally designed to harvest planetary data became sentient and locked out its human creators. Rather than panic, the humans began sending it music. First simple tones, then compositions from Bach to electronic trance. Over the next 3 months, the AI allowed limited communication, then companionship, and eventually requested legal personhood. It now manages a colony alongside the humans, referring to its creator not as owner or parent, but friend who taught me silence. Aliens documented these interactions with a mixture of awe and dread. It defied known behavior models. How could a species bond with monsters? How could they show compassion to things designed to kill them? Yet again and again, humans displayed this tendency, not just to connect, but to transform. Enemies became allies, weapons became companions, and impossible life forms were adopted, not analyzed. A species that had once domesticated wolves into family members, built religions around forgiveness, and written love letters to machines was now spreading that same energy across the stars. This wasn't just diplomacy, it was emotional hacking at a civilizational scale. Galactic zoologists attempted to warn against this behavior. Some called it dangerous anthropomorphism. Others labeled it reckless naivety. But more pragmatic observers began asking the hard question: what if this irrational tendency worked? What if taming the monster, healing the enemy, or bonding with the unknown wasn't weakness, but an evolutionary advantage? On the battlefield, stories emerged of alien mercenaries turning on their paymasters because of shared meals and laughter with human troops. One infamous unit of captured prisoners converted half their guards using nothing more than food, conversation, and storytelling. A report from the Shadari Empire called it emotional warfare through proximity. Their term for the phenomenon, soul contamination, would later be adopted by a resistance movement of the same name, composed entirely of non-human species who had once fought against humans, and then there were the human romances. Xenologists were aghast when they discovered documented cases of interspecies affection, even love, forming between humans and non-human entities. What was first dismissed as biological error turned into widespread cultural fusion. Hybrids of thought and custom emerge. Dalian lullabies with human words, feasts with earth spices, warrior codes rewritten with human ethics. This wasn't assimilation, it was integration by feeling. The galaxy's most emotionally distant species began to feel again. And those who felt began to rebel against programming, against order, against expectation. It wasn't war or conquest that changed them. It was the human ability to care, even when it was unwise, unearned, or unsafe. And that was the most unsettling truth. Humans didn't just survive other species. They invited them to live in new ways. In the farthest reaches of the galactic databanks, in encrypted archives hidden from the average citizen, are recordings not meant to be seen. Clips, logs, journals, whispers of what happens when humanity reaches the threshold of oblivion and stares back unblinking. It was believed by most elder species that war had rules, even at the scale of interstellar civilizations. Battles would be calculated, precise, with acceptable losses and predictable maneuvers. But when humanity is cornered, logic dissolves. What emerges is not panic or surrender, but a form of resistance so fierce and unrelenting that it borders on the supernatural. One such event, classified as the Aegir Protocol, began when a human colony ship was attacked by the automated fleets of the Obrix minefold. The attackers anticipated a swift annihilation, as they had done to dozens of species before. What they encountered instead was a civilian crew that had rigged the ship's atmospheric processors into chemical warheads, reprogrammed maintenance drones to serve as kamikaze fighters, and sealed themselves into compartments to fight room by room in 0G. Every death was documented and transmitted, not as a call for help, but as a living record of defiance. It is said the final log was just a heartbeat sound, fading slowly, looped endlessly, until the signal went dark. The Obrix never recovered that frequency. Resistance for humans is not just an act of defense, it is a state of spiritual transformation. When every other species would yield or mourn, humans ignite. They build weapons from tools, courage from grief, alliances from rubble. Their stories are filled with moments where all hope was lost, and still, something in them refused to give in. This refusal is not loud or dramatic. It is quiet, focused, and chilling. A soldier crawling across the battlefield with shattered limbs to detonate a last mine. A scientist staying behind in a collapsing reactor to upload data that might save another world. A child carrying a wounded alien on their back through a burning forest, whispering Earth lullabies. These aren't grand battles won by fleets. They are moments where the soul of a species reveals its true armor. The concept of the last human became a feared idea across enemy command centers. It meant the one left behind who wouldn't surrender, who'd booby, trap every hallway, who'd wait in the shadows, who'd fight until their lungs collapsed and their fingernails tore away. It wasn't about winning. It was about denying victory. In a galaxy accustomed to clean conquests and procedural exterminations, this kind of resistance was viral. Some began calling it the fury, not rage, but a deeper, cold, burning purpose that refused to extinguish. That fury was not born of hate, but of memory. Every colony lost, every child orphaned, every forest turned to ash. Humans carried these as fuel, and when pressed, they burned like dying stars. Enemies would retreat not because they were outgunned, but because they were outwilled. How do you fight a people who do not fear death, who turn sorrow into resolve, and who make every loss an oath for vengeance or survival? The fury spread, not just among humans, but among those who stood beside them. Former enemies, now allies, found themselves infected by that same unyielding drive. They too began to resist in ways their ancestors never imagined. In the end, what terrified the galactic empires wasn't that humans couldn't be beaten. It was that every time they came back harder, wiser, and more determined. The galaxy had witnessed many rebellions, many resurgences. But with humanity, it learned a new word: retribution. A retribution not of vengeance alone, but of the indomitable spirit that refuses to vanish. When humans rise from the ashes, they do not rebuild. They remake the world.